Good morning, dear learners. I am Dr. Bishwajit Khumukcham. In this lesson titled Reimagining Poetry, Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads, I examine William Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads, a foundational text in English literary criticism. The lesson explains the poetic principles that shaped the Romantic view of literature and helped redefine the purpose and language of poetry in the late 18th century. To fully appreciate the revolutionary character of Wordsworth's preface, one must first understand the poetic tradition against which he was reacting. The 18th century, often called the Augustan age, in English literature was dominated by poets such as Alexander Pope, John Dryden, and Samuel Johnson. These writers valued order, reason, and decorum above all else. Their poetry drew heavily on classical models from ancient Rome and Greece, employing heroic couplets, elaborate rhetorical devices, and a highly redefined poetic diction that deliberately distinguished poetic language from ordinary speech. Their poetry drew heavily on classical models from ancient Rome and Greece, employing heroic couplets, elaborate rhetorical devices, and a highly refined poetic diction that deliberately distinguished poetic language from ordinary speech. The subjects of Augustan poetry were typically drawn from city life, intellectual circles, and public affairs, with satire and moral commentary serving as favored modes of expression. Poetry in this tradition was seen as a craft governed by established rules, a form of art that demonstrated the poet's wit, learning, and mastery of technique rather than personal emotion or natural simplicity. It was this carefully constructed but increasingly artificial poetic establishment that Wordsworth sought to challenge and transform. The close of 18th century witnessed a profound shift in English literary sensibilities, moving away from the structured rationalism of Augustan age toward a new emphasis on individual emotion and natural wonder. It was within this transformative period that William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge published Lyrical Ballads in 1798, a collection that would forever alter the course of English poetry. However, the true manifesto of this literary revolution emerged 2 years later when Wordsworth appended a critical essay to the collection's second edition. This essay subsequently expanded in 1802 and now known as the Preface to Lyrical Ballad, stands as a deliberate and passionate defense of experimental poems contained within the volume. Wordsworth, anticipating confusion and resistance from readers accustomed to established poetic conventions, felt compelled to articulate the theoretical foundations upon which these unconventional poems were built. The preface, therefore, is not merely an introduction to a book of poems, but a carefully reasoned argument for a complete reorientation of literary values, challenging the very definitions of poetry, poetic language, and the poet's relationship with society that had dominated critical thought for over a century. Now, let's look at Wordsworth as a Romantic critic. Although Wordsworth is primarily remembered as a poet, the preface reveals him as a significant literary critic. Through this essay, he challenges the conventions that had dominated English poetry during the 18th century. Earlier poetry followed strict artistic rules and often favored elevated subjects drawn from classical history or aristocratic life. Wordsworth questioned these assumptions. He argued that poetry should return to genuine human feeling and to the natural world. For this reason, the preface is often regarded as defining statement of Romantic literary thought. It presents a new critical framework in which imagination, emotion, and individual experience become central elements of poetic creation. Now let's look at the subject matter of poetry. One of Wordsworth's most radical claims concerns the subject of poetry. He rejects the belief that poetry must deal with grand or heroic events. Instead, he argues that the poet should select incidents from ordinary life. Wordsworth places particular value on rural and humble settings. In simple rural communities, he suggests, human emotions appear in a more direct and authentic form. The praises and artificial manners of urban society often conceal genuine feeling, whereas rustic life allows the fundamental patience of human heart to develop more freely. By focusing on common experiences, work, nature, family life, and personal reflection, poetry can reveal universal truths about human existence. Through this approach, Wordsworth expands the scope of poetry and allows it to speak to a wider human audience. Now, let's look at the language of poetry. Wordsworth's theory of poetic language represents another major departure from earlier practice. Many 18th century poets employed an elaborate poetic diction filled with ornament, elevated expressions, and artificial phrasing. Wordsworth regarded this style as distant from real human speech. He therefore argues that poetry should use the language actually spoken by ordinary people. Such language is simple, direct, and emotionally sincere. According to Wordsworth, the speech of humble rural communities preserves a natural clarity that enables genuine feelings to be communicated more effectively. This does not mean that poetry abandons artistic form. Rather, Wordsworth believes that poetic language should arise naturally from lived experience. The aim is to communicate emotional truth rather than to display verbal decoration. Now let's have a look at Wordsworth's concept of poetry. Perhaps the most widely quoted statement from the preface is Wordsworth's definition of poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. He adds that these feelings originate from emotion recollected in tranquility. This definition reveals an important aspect of poetic process. Poetry does not emerge in the immediate moment of emotional intensity. Instead, the poet first experiences strong feelings through interaction with life and nature. Later, during a calm moment of reflection, the poet recollects these experiences and transforms them through imagination. Wordsworth also outlines stages in the process of poetic creation. The poet begins with observation of the external world. These observations generate emotional responses that remain in the memory. Through reflection and contemplation, the emotions gain depth and clarity. Finally, imagination shapes these experiences into poetic expression. Poetry, therefore, arises from a dynamic interaction between experience, memory, and creative imagination. Now, let's look at the role of the poet. Wordsworth offers a striking description of the poet as man speaking to man. This statement emphasizes the poet's connection with ordinary humanity. The poet does not belong to a separate or privileged class. Instead, the poet shares the same emotions and experiences as other people. At the same time, the poet possesses heightened sensitivity and imagination. The poet observes life more closely, feels emotions more deeply, and expresses them with greater clarity. Because of this capacity, the poet can articulate experiences that others may feel but cannot easily express. In this way, poetry becomes a means of communication between individuals and wider human community. Now, let's look at the use of meter. Wordsworth also addresses the formal structure of poetry, particularly the use of meter. He supports the continued use of meter because rhythmic structure produces aesthetic pleasure and emotional balance. Meter moderates the intensity of strong feelings and gives poetic expression a sense of harmony. Even when the language of poetry remains simple, meter adds musical quality and artistic order. For Wordsworth, meter helps transform everyday language into a form capable of sustaining emotional depth and imaginative power. Now, a very important topic, Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction. Wordsworth's discussion of poetic diction continues his argument for natural expression. He criticizes the decorative language that had become fashionable in earlier poetry, arguing that such language often hides genuine emotion. According to Wordsworth, the language of poetry should emerge naturally from the poet's feelings and experiences. Artificial ornament weakens the authenticity of emotional expression. True poetic diction therefore reflects the simple yet powerful language through which human beings express their deepest passions. This theory restores poetry to its connection with real life. Language becomes a medium through which human emotion, imagination, and reflection find their most authentic expression. The enduring significance of Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballad extends far beyond its immediate historical context, continuing to resonate with readers and writers more than 2 centuries after its composition. The essay's revolutionary insistence on the dignity of ordinary experience and the value of authentic emotional expression permanently expanded the possibilities of poetic subject matter, liberating subsequent generations of poets from the constraint of elevated classical themes. Furthermore, Wordsworth's emphasis on accessible language anticipated modern movements toward greater inclusivity and directness in literary expression, while his concept of the poet as an ordinary person speaking to ordinary people democratized the creative process itself. The preface also established a critical vocabulary for discussing the relationship between emotion and artistic creation that remains influential in literary studies today, with concepts such as spontaneous overflow and emotion recollected in tranquility continuing to inform our understanding of how imaginative literature emerges from lived experience. In conclusion, Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballad represents a turning point in the history of English literature. The essay redefines the aim and method of poetry by emphasizing emotion, imagination, and the experiences of ordinary life. By rejecting artificial poetic diction and aristocratic themes, Wordsworth establishes a new poetic vision rooted in nature and human feeling. Poetry becomes an expression of lived experience rather than a display of rhetorical skill. For this reason, the preface remains a central text in literary studies. It not only shaped the Romantic movement but also transformed the way later generations understand nature and the purpose of poetry. The essay's profound meditation on the relationship between human emotion and creative expression ensures its place not merely as a historical document, but as a living work of criticism that continues to challenge, inspire, and guide our ongoing conversation about what poetry can achieve and why it matters to human life. Thank you so much for your time.